Today on The Journey, from Steve DeWitt.
Sin, we come to find out, isn't just about doing what we shouldn't do. It has consequences in our personhood, right down to the core of our being, right down to that aspect of our sexuality, our maleness, and our femaleness.
The path of rebellion against God always leads back to Eden. And today on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt traces humanity's journey from creation to current culture. We're learning how rebellion against God impacts human identity and finding hope for returning to His perfect plan. It's the start of a message titled Gender and Sexuality from our Being Human series. This message contains mature themes, so if there are little ears around, you may want to listen on your own time by visiting thejourney.fm. Here's Pastor Steve DeWitt.
You know, sexuality and gender are essential to our humanity. We see it right there in Genesis 1. He could have said, yeah, I created these beings and gave no detail. No, he tells us that we are sexual, male and female. We are gendered, male and female. And God engineered into the very character of our personhood, right down to our chromosomes, that we are sexual and we are gendered. We are XX and we are XY. Now you might ask, haven't we been doing this gendered sexuality thing for long enough that we don't really need to talk about this? I mean, we've been doing this for centuries. Why do we need to talk about it like this? How can there be any confusion about sexuality if we went from Adam and Eve, two people, to presently 8 billion people on earth? Clearly, we have figured out the anatomical plumbing, what goes where, and how billions of people could be born. I mean, haven't we figured this out? And further, haven't we figured out the gender thing? I mean, it's all around us. Have you been to a gender reveal party for a pregnant couple? Or maybe, we've got bathrooms, we've got clothing. Like, why are we talking about this? Well, Toto, we are not in Kansas anymore. Does being human require us to connect our biological birth gender with our expressed or lived out gender? Does that matter? Does the Bible have anything to say about that subject? Other than politics, human gender issues have dominated media and public discourse in the West, Western civilization. And there's so many examples of this. I'm sure you are largely aware of what I'm talking about. Controversies regarding bathroom and who gets to use what. Transgenderism and women's sports. Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner. And now the very pervasive option, if you are filling out a form at the doctor's office or online or for your new streaming service, when they ask you, M, F, or other, or non-binary. And if you're not kind of aware of these things, you look at that, you're like, what? What are they talking about? Well, you're going to leave here today well-informed. Now, further, over the last 20 years, there are terms that have emerged that without an updated dictionary can be very hard to keep up with. Suddenly, we have these new words that are tossed around like everybody totally knows what these words mean, of course, and we all know them, we agree upon them. Words like binary, cisgender, transgender, intersectionality, gender dysphoria, LGBTQ+, pansexual, bisexual, omnisexual, and on the list goes. So that's the state of things right now. Let's begin by talking about how did we get to this point? How did we get here in our culture? And the answer has everything to do with the Garden of Eden. It is in that Edenic perfection that sin broke and distorted that perfection. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve rebelled against God, which changed their nature. We saw in our Romans series that flesh, the sin nature that now is in all of us because we are sinners. We are born with this sin nature. Visit the nursery and you'll see it on display. We don't have to be taught how to sin. We are sinners by nature now. And that nature that prior to sin delighted in God, delighted in his will, wanted what God wanted more than anything else, now has this deeply distorted nature, this rebellion. The Bible talks about it as a rebellion against God. Male and female image bearers made to delight in God now delight in what is not God or what is against the will of God. We don't want God telling us what to do. Now, we are still moral. We are still image bearers. We still have a conscience. And guess what? We're still males and females. Have you noticed? We still have our maleness and our femaleness, but now with a disoriented perspective about that. The most fundamental distortion has to do with this vertical worship thing that we cannot get away from. And down through history, every society has been oriented towards worship of something or someone, and that is because we were made to be worshipers. And Paul in Romans 1, before he gets into explaining what the gospel is, he begins in Romans 1 by explaining why we need the gospel, the sad state of affairs in human society. And here's how he describes it. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up in a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. So Romans 1 tells a sad tale. Sin, we come to find out, isn't just about doing what we shouldn't do. It has consequences in our personhood right down to the core of our being, right down to that aspect of our sexuality, our maleness, and our femaleness, and now a nature that wants to rebel against anything that reminds us that there is a God. And anything that God said that we should be, we don't want to be that anymore. Who are you to tell us what to do? And we rebel against everything. Listen, everything in Genesis 1 that God said is very good. We say, no, it's not. It's not good. And neither are you, by the way. So how do we get to the point where sexuality and gender identity are the way they are? It is part of our rebellion against God. That's what I want you to see. It is part and parcel, along with a host of other things that we could add. There's a lot of other sins that don't fit in this category, but it is certainly part of that rebellion against God. And you should take some comfort in this. Sometimes people are like, it's worse than it's ever been. No, it's not. Read your Bible. Ever heard of Sodom and Gomorrah? Read the account in Genesis 19, and you will see that it can get a lot worse than it is. But we see then that the seeds of sexual confusion, which is what the word dysphoria means, that these didn't start at Woodstock. These started in Genesis 3. This is an ancient story. We are merely living the most recent chapter of it. So how do we get here? Sin is rebellion against God. Sinners reject God on every level and seek that rejection on the level of their gender and reject God's good purpose and providence in creating us as either male or female, biologically male or female. Or we reject God's created plan for heterosexual relations between biological males and biological females. Now, if I can lean, I'm going to dig into this a little bit. Class, this is a little bit less of a maybe, I don't know, sermon-y sermon. It's a little bit more of a teaching sermon for sure. But I want to lean in on how we got here because I think it helps us view the world that we live in. And I'm going to lean on some trusted experts in telling this story. How do we get here in Western culture? The roots of this are in influential thinkers, philosophers, writers like Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin. Those three and others sought to define what it means to be a human being without God. Their writings, their whole philosophies, there's no God, let's define humanity simply from humanity. And by doing that, if there is no God, if there is no divine revelation, if there is no ultimate accountability, what that means then is that we are free. Yay! We're free to define ourselves the way we jolly well want to. God doesn't have anything to say about it. And from this perspective emerged a view of human life that is now the creed of the culture that we live in. What is that? The highest good for human life, the highest virtue is you must be true to yourself. You gotta be who you are. You must be yourself. You be you, I'll be me. And when you throw into the mix of that, what Freud taught, which was that the most essential us is who we are sexually, you end up with a sinful humanity that wants to rid itself of all divine sexual and gender identity constraints. Theologian Carl Trueman wrote a book, much heralded book, called recently, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And he writes, he says, I decided to do this book when I heard a statement that is accepted in our culture. I am a woman trapped in a man's body. And he says, I got thinking about that. I mean, you can make any statement that you want, but that became like an accepted principle, a truth in our culture. And he said, I decided to write this book to explore how we could ever get to the point where somebody could say that and everyone nods their head. And so he writes this book and he describes how we got here in 3 essential steps. The first step was the acceptance of expressive individualism. What he means by that is that the self became ultimate in our culture. Secondly, the primacy of the inner self. Not just the self who I am, physically or outwardly, but the elevation of those feelings that I have inside, that those are the real me. No matter how distorted they might be, no matter how perverse they might be, no matter what, that is the real me. And I have to live out the real me. And then thirdly, the necessity of therapeutic well-being. And what that means is that in our culture, the ultimate goal is that inner sense of peace and tranquility. I've got to be true to myself. I've got to live out who I am because my happiness and the pursuit of my happiness is the ultimate virtue in our culture. So what is the purpose of life today? What do we hear? To find yourself, to be true to yourself, to make sure that you're happy. And no one can tell you to live in any other way than whatever makes you personally happy. And so when you have a man, for example, that cross-dresses and does so publicly, that man being true to his inner self, and that has to be not only accepted, it needs to be celebrated. When a woman says that she is a man, who can tell her otherwise? Why? Because herself is the transcendent truth. She's being true to who she thinks that she is. And so we see in this then that there is a different cultural dictionary and a different cultural Bible, but it is a religion. It is the religion of the secular culture around us. And we better understand how we got here and why people look at the world the way that they do. Truman says this: while sex may be presented today as little more than a recreational activity, sexuality is presented as that which lies at the very heart of what it means to be an authentic person. That is a profound claim that is arguably unprecedented in history. When you realize the things that are being said right, no human being in all of human history has ever looked at the world the way that people now pervasively and religiously look at the world and look at themselves in the mirror. So, for example, let's go back to Bruce Jenner. That was a decisive moment in this story in our culture when Olympic hero Bruce Jenner transitioned to female Caitlyn Jenner. And if you remember the hoopla that surrounded that, she was described as being a courageous hero and won all kinds of trophies and a lot of these, awards ceremonies, which honestly, I watch those. But at those, Jenner walked out with trophies. There's a whole case at the house of trophies of heroism for what transpired with Jenner. If you step back from that and think, what worldview views that transition as heroic? It is one whose first commandment is this: you shall love yourself with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I got thinking about this, I've got, as you know, young daughters, and some of the animated movies that we've watched a few hundred times. It's one thing about kids, like if I see a movie, I kind of saw it. Other than Star Wars, I don't need to see it again. Kids will watch things over and over again and over and over and over again. So I got thinking about the very, very popular movie Frozen, and listen to the words in light of what I'm talking about. Let it go, let it go. It goes on to say this: to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. You can almost imagine Eve as she reached for the forbidden fruit. Dun 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 dun. Thinking in her heart, with this, I'm free. And we know from the story, she was free prior, and none of us have been free ever since. Remember how Satan tempted Eve. What did he question? He questioned the goodness of God. Did God really say that you shouldn't eat of the fruit? And what was he insinuating? God doesn't really love you. His plan isn't really the best plan. You need to be free of God, and therefore you should try out this forbidden fruit. And Truman describes this now as a secular kind of creed, this war on God, organized religion. He's describing from the perspective of the secular creed, okay? Organized religion, with its imposition on humanity of the law code contained in the Bible, is that which has alienated human beings from each other and destroyed true liberty. Christianity must therefore be destroyed and marriage abolished, or at least dramatically redefined, if human beings are to be truly free and truly happy. Now, that's not what he's promoting. He's describing from the secular position. That's how they view all these things. So if you take that as the creed and say, how does that then come down to the individual in our culture living out the creed? What does that look like? What does that look like in terms of sexual identity or gender identity? And what if our rejection of God's purpose was right at the core. Like, what is the bullseye, the essential of what it means to be a human being? What would that look like to be free of male and female? He created them. How do you reject that? Again, a purpose that you see in the shower every morning. How do you get past that? Here's how. Okay, and this is what's going on. By separating biological or birth sex, chromosome sex, from gender, or the choice of gender that you choose to live. To divide genitalia from gender. Divide chromosomes from gender. Make gender a fluid choice that people can make, regardless of what your chromosomes say you are, or your plumbing says that you are, or your birth certificate says that you are in terms of gender. And then you have the world that we live in, where you can have whatever chromosome, but live out a different gender, male or female, a different sexuality, heterosexual or pansexual or homosexual or bisexual or whatever sexual. The secular creed is there are no rules for this, except the individual is sovereign and their feelings inside dictate who they really are. And that's how we get to the world that we live in today. Andrew Walker, our culture says your psychology is your sexual identity. Let your body be conformed to it. I'm sorry, this is Sam Albury. The Bible says your body is your sexual identity. Let your mind be conformed to it. You see how they've turned it on their head there. Now, Andrew Walker. The ideological assumptions driving the transgender revolution did not even exist until very recently. This revolution required certain epistemological, that means how we know what we know, and moral shifts in order for it to emerge as legitimate. Transgenderism is birthed out of Western society's challenges to the institution of marriage and out of the project of social revolutionaries, I named some of them earlier, to redefine sexuality and normalize same-sex relationships. These shifts deconstructed objective social norms and instead advocated a social construction of reality.
You're listening to The Journey with Pastor Steve DeWitt and a message titled Gender and Sexuality. To hear it again, visit thejourney.fm. Well, we just want to let you know that we're deeply grateful for our faithful listeners and supporters who make The Journey possible. Your generosity enables us to share life-changing biblical truth across the nation through radio and digital platforms. Every day, we receive messages from people whose lives have been transformed through these broadcasts. From the busy parent finding wisdom during their morning commute, to the lonely soul discovering hope in the middle of the night. As we begin 2025, we're resolved to reach more hearts with God's unchanging truth in our ever-changing world. And your partnership makes these transformations possible. Will you join us in this mission? You can call us at 844-7-JOURNEY. That's 844-756-8763. Or visit thejourney.fm. And as a token of our appreciation for your gift, we'll send you Dr. Julie Slattery's groundbreaking book, Rethinking Sexuality, God's Design and Why It Matters. This isn't just another book about relationships. It's a comprehensive guide to understanding sexuality within God's divine plan. Drawing from biblical wisdom and clinical experience, Dr. Slattery helps us address today's complex sexual challenges with truth and grace. She provides a framework for understanding sexual wholeness and healing, equipping readers to minister effectively to those struggling with brokenness. This book is an essential resource for navigating these vital issues in your family and community. Let its powerful message guide you to understand and share God's design for sexuality in a deeper way this coming year. Ask for your copy of Rethinking Sexuality today. Call 844-7-JOURNEY or visit thejourney.fm. I'm Tim Svoboda. Come back tomorrow when Pastor Steve concludes his lesson all about biblical gender and sexuality. That's Friday on The Journey. Today's program was produced and furnished by Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana.